Did you honestly believe I wouldn't make it back?" David's voice was a lethal, localized earthquake. Barely above a whisper, but carrying enough primal authority to rattle the crystal bourbon glasses resting on the nightstand. He stood framed in the bedroom doorway, the freezing rain of the city still dripping from his trench coat. Staring at the tangled Egyptian cotton sheets, Mira didn't scramble to pull the duvet to her chin. She simply sat up, her dark eyes wide, reflecting the neon bleed of the skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Beside her, the man shifted, a lazy, arrogant smirk playing across his bruised mouth. "You were reported dead in the northern wastes, David," Julian murmured, adjusting a silk pillow behind his head. "I am the Alpha King," David said, stepping into the room as the air pressure plummeted with his killing intent. "And you are in my way. Get out of his bed, Mira, now." The journey back to the capital had been a grueling, 6-month descent into absolute hell. David had fought through insurgencies in the frozen northern wastes, relying on nothing but feral instinct, tactical brilliance, and the burning memory of his Luna, Mira, to keep his heart beating. He had taken shrapnel to the ribs, survived a poisoned blade, and led his loyalists to a crushing victory. All he wanted, the singular obsession that had kept him tethered to his humanity, was to walk through the mahogany doors of his estate, bury his face in her neck, and breathe in the scent of vanilla and rain. But the estate had been empty, worse than empty. It felt abandoned. The staff was operating on a skeleton crew, the fireplaces were cold, and Mira's scent in their master bedroom was stale, heavily masked by the sterile smell of chemical cleaners. When David had demanded answers from his beta, Marcus, the older wolf, had looked at the floor, his jaw tight, refusing to meet his king's eyes. That was the first red flag. Marcus feared nothing, yet he had trembled when he handed David a piece of paper with an address in the financial district. It wasn't just any address. It was the penthouse of Julian Vance. Julian was a rogue-born alpha who had traded claws for corporate takeovers, a billionaire who had spent the last decade trying to dismantle David's pack through economic warfare rather than blood. David hadn't waited for an explanation. He had driven his Aston Martin through the torrential downpour of the city, his knuckles bone white on the steering wheel, his inner wolf snarling against the confines of his mind. The beast wanted blood. David, the king, wanted logic. But as he stood in the private elevator of Julian's high-rise, watching the floor numbers tick upward to the 99th floor, logic felt increasingly like a useless weapon. He bypassed the biometric locks with a localized EMP pulse from his watch. Military grade, a perk of his title, the heavy oak doors to the penthouse slid open with a soft hiss. The immediate sensory overload hit him like a physical blow. The penthouse smelled of ozone, expensive bergamot cologne, and her. The sweet, unmistakable scent of vanilla was woven intimately into the heavy, musky aura of another alpha. It wasn't the scent of a brief meeting or a tense negotiation. It was the settled, lingering scent of cohabitation. David moved through the dimly lit, sprawling living room like a shadow. His footsteps made no sound on the imported Persian rugs. He bypassed the modern art pieces, the sweeping grand piano, and moved straight toward the master's suite, following the invisible ribbon of her scent. He didn't kick the door down. He pushed it open slowly, letting the heavy hinges glide in absolute silence. The scene before him burned itself into his retinas, a permanent scar on his psyche. The room was bathed in the ambient, shifting light of the city below. The bed was enormous, chaotic with tossed silk sheets. Julian lay there, his chest bare, an irritatingly calm demeanor masking the sudden spike in his heart rate. And there was Mira. She wore a thin, silk camisole. Her dark hair was tousled, falling over her bare shoulders. She looked breathtaking, as she always did. But the context twisted her beauty into a jagged knife that plunged directly into David's chest. When David spoke, uttering the words that would fracture their reality, he watched her meticulously. He expected the classic signs of a cornered traitor: tears, frantic apologies, the desperate scrambling for clothes, or the sudden, terrified scent of guilt. He got none of it. Mira's body went completely rigid. Her gaze locked onto his, and for a fraction of a second, David thought he saw a flash of profound, agonizing relief in her dark eyes. But it was gone instantly, replaced by a cold, impenetrable mask. She didn't look at Julian. She didn't reach for the sheets. "David," she said. Her voice was steady, a stark contrast to the trembling of her fingertips resting on the mattress. "I won't repeat myself, Mira," David said, his voice dropping another octave. His hands were stuffed into the pockets of his trench coat to hide the fact that his claws were extending, slicing through the lining. He looked at Julian. "If you move your hands from where I can see them, Vance, I will sever them from your wrists. Do you understand?" Julian offered a tight, patronizing smile. "You're trespassing, Your Majesty. The world thinks you're buried under a glacier. Things have moved on. Get up, Mira." David ignored the billionaire entirely, his eyes boring into his mate. "We are leaving?" Mira finally moved. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet hitting the hardwood floor. She didn't grab a coat. She didn't look back at the man in the bed. She walked toward David with the stiff, measured steps of a soldier marching to a firing squad. The elevator ride down to the parking garage was suffocating. David stood in the back corner, his broad shoulders squared, radiating a heat that was almost palpable. The metallic walls of the cab seemed to shrink with every floor they descended. Mira stood precisely 2 feet away from him, her posture perfect, her gaze fixed dead ahead on the brass numbers counting down. She was still wearing only the thin silk camisole and a pair of matching sleep shorts. The chill of the elevator air conditioning raised goosebumps on her arms, but she didn't shiver. She simply endured it. David's mind was a war zone. His wolf demanded immediate, catastrophic violence. It wanted to rip the steel doors open, climb back up the elevator shaft, and tear Julian Vance's throat out. But David was an alpha king because he knew how to chain the beast when necessary. If he killed a high-profile civilian like Vance without proof of a direct pack threat, the human authorities would descend, and the ensuing scandal would bankrupt the pack's legitimate enterprises. He needed control. He needed to understand the board before he flipped the table. Why? The question hammered against his skull. Mira was not a superficial woman drawn to wealth or status. She already had both as his Luna. They had been deeply, fiercely in love. When he had left for the war, she had pressed her forehead to his, tears streaming down her face, making him swear on his soul that he would return. Now, 6 months later, she was in the bed of his greatest political rival, and she wasn't even fighting to defend herself. Nothing to say? David finally broke the silence as the elevator chimed at the basement level. His tone was conversational, which only made it more terrifying. "Would it matter?" Mira asked softly. Her voice was devoid of emotion, hollowed out. "It usually helps to plead for your life when you've committed high treason against your alpha," David replied, stepping out of the elevator. He shrugged off his heavy, rain-soaked trench coat and threw it over her shoulders. The action was purely instinctual, a possessive need to cover her, to warm her, even as he wanted to shake the truth out of her. Mira flinched when the heavy coat landed on her. the lingering scent of his blood and sweat wrapping around her. For a moment, her stoic facade cracked, her lower lip trembling, but she bit down on it hard, tasting copper. "I am not pleading for anything, David." He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but careful not to bruise. He pulled her toward the sleek black Bentley idling in the VIP section of the garage. Marcus stood by the rear door, an umbrella in hand. The beta's eyes widened slightly when he saw Mira's state of undress beneath the coat. But he wisely kept his mouth shut, opening the door for them. The drive to the Alpha estate was a study in psychological torture. The rain lashed against the tinted windows, blurring the neon lights of the city into streaks of bleeding color. David stared out the window, processing the fragments of data his heightened senses had gathered in the penthouse. Julian had been smug, yes, but he hadn't smelled like a man who had just claimed another man's mate. There was no scent of arousal in the room, just tension, stale air, and the underlying metallic tang of adrenaline. Furthermore, Mira's pulse right now wasn't racing with the panic of a guilty lover. It was a slow, heavy, defeated thud. She was hiding something massive. As the iron gates of the estate parted and the car rolled up the sweeping gravel driveway, David made a decision. He would not let his anger dictate the game. She wanted to play the Ice Queen. He would freeze the very air around her until she shattered. The car stopped. Marcus opened the door. David stepped out into the rain, ignoring the umbrella, and waited for Mira to follow. She stepped onto the gravel, her bare feet instantly freezing, the oversized trench coat dragging on the ground. "Marcus," David said, not looking at his beta. "Take the Luna to the West Wing guest quarters. Lock the doors. Disable the communication lines. She is not to speak to anyone, and no one is to speak to her." Mira finally snapped her head up, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden, desperate panic. "David, no. You can't put me in the West Wing. You need to let me make a phone call. Just one." David stepped close to her, the rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. He leaned in, his voice a dangerous, velvet purr. "You lost the right to make demands the moment you climbed into another man's bed. You will sit in that room, Mira, and you will wait until I decide what to do with you." He turned on his heel and walked toward the main entrance, leaving her standing in the rain, the heavy doors of the estate closing with a resounding, final thud. The Alpha's study was a sanctuary of dark mahogany, leather-bound histories, and silence. Usually, the room smelled of old paper and the sharp, clean scent of pine. Tonight, it reeked of stale whiskey and simmering, volatile rage. David sat behind his massive desk, the amber liquid in his crystal glass untouched. The adrenaline of his return, the violent surge that had carried him into Julian Vance's penthouse, was slowly receding, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. His ribs, still healing from a jagged piece of mortar shrapnel in the northern wastes, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. But physical pain was a distant, secondary static compared to the agonizing loop playing in his mind. Mira, on that bed, looking at him with eyes devoid of love. He did not want to feel the hurt. He needed to think like a king. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Marcus stepped inside. The beta looked 10 years older than when David had last seen him. The silver at his temples had spread, and the lines around his eyes were etched deep with chronic stress. He carried a thick stack of manila folders, dropping them onto the desk with a heavy thud. "You asked for the pack's financial and security logs for the last 6 months, sire," Marcus said, keeping his voice carefully neutral. He stood at attention, his posture rigid, waiting for the inevitable explosion. "Sit down, Marcus," David commanded, his voice a low rumble. He gestured to the leather chair opposite him. "And tell me exactly how long I was considered dead." Marcus exhaled slowly, sinking into the chair. 3 months and 12 days. After the avalanche at the Blood Ridge Pass, our scouts found your command tent crushed. They recovered your silver signet ring from the wreckage, covered in blood. The High Council declared you KIA. We held a memorial. The pack mourned, David. We all did. "And Mira?" David asked, the name feeling like glass in his throat. "The Luna didn't leave this estate for 2 weeks," Marcus said softly, his eyes dropping to the desk. "She didn't eat. She barely drank. Her wails. Sire, they echoed through the halls at night. It broke the pack's heart. We thought the mate bond severing was going to kill her. But then, on the 15th day, she walked out of the master suite. She was wearing a tailored suit, her face was like stone, and she demanded a full audit of our human-facing corporations." David frowned, leaning forward. "Why?" "Because the moment the council declared you dead, the wolves circled. The corporate ones." Marcus spat with disdain. "Julian Vance initiated a massive, coordinated attack on our infrastructure. He bought up the debt on our legitimate shipping companies. He bribed human city officials to rezone our territory in the warehouse district, threatening to evict thousands of our lower-income pack members. He was orchestrating a legal, bloodless genocide of our territory." David flipped open the top folder. The balance sheets were a bloodbath of red ink. Foreclosures, frozen assets, hostile takeovers. Vance had weaponized human capitalism against them, exploiting the power vacuum of David's supposed death. We were preparing for physical war. Marcus continued, his voice tight with shame. We were ready to shift and tear Vance Corp apart. Human laws be damned. But the Luna ordered us to stand down. She said a blood war would bring the human military down on us, exposing our kind. She said she would handle it. By moving into his penthouse? David's eyes flashed a dangerous, luminous gold in the dim light. The crystal glass in his hand cracked under his tightening grip. She surrendered. Marcus whispered. 2 months ago, Vance gave an ultimatum. He would freeze the evictions and back off the shipping lanes if the Alpha Estate surrendered its sovereignty. Mira went to his tower to negotiate. She never came back. The evictions stopped the next day. David sat back, the fragmented pieces of the puzzle clicking into a sickening, distorted picture. Mira had sacrificed herself to save the pack from ruin. It was a noble, tragic gesture. The kind of self-martyrdom expected of a Luna protecting her people in the absence of her king. But it didn't explain the reality of what David had witnessed. If she went as a political hostage, as a treaty, David murmured, tapping his index finger against his lips, his tactical mind cutting through his emotional agony. Then why was she in his bed, Marcus? Why the silk sleepwear? Why did it look like she belonged there? Marcus shook his head helplessly. I don't know, sire. She cut off all contact with us. There is something else, David said, his voice turning deadly cold. Something you all missed. I stood in that room. I breathed the air. He locked eyes with his beta. Vance's scent was everywhere. But it wasn't on her. He hasn't claimed her. He hasn't marked her. There was no scent of intimacy between them. Marcus blinked, stunned. But they've been cohabitating for 8 weeks. Vance is an alpha. The instinct to claim... Exactly, David said, standing up. Vance is a predatory opportunist. He wouldn't keep a beautiful, powerful Luna in his bed for 2 months just to play chess. Something is stopping him, or she is holding something over him. and she practically begged for a single phone call when I locked her away. David walked around the desk, his trench coat swapping shadows against the walls. She is playing a game, Marcus. A highly dangerous, deeply classified game. And she didn't drop the act when I walked in, because the game isn't over. David turned toward the door, his jaw set. Keep the perimeter secured. No one goes in or out. I'm going to the West Wing. The West Wing guest quarters were designed for visiting dignitaries. Luxurious, expansive, but ultimately defensible. Right now, it functioned as a high-end solitary confinement. Mira paced the length of the Persian rug, her bare feet making no sound. The heavy trench coat David had thrown over her swallowed her petite frame, the sleeves rolling past her fingertips. She was shivering, but not from the chill of the air conditioning. It was a deep, systemic tremor, a physical manifestation of a carefully constructed plan unraveling at the seams. She stopped and stared at the antique grandfather clock in the corner. 3:15 a.m. Her chest tightened, a cold vice gripping her lungs. She had missed the check-in. Every night at 3 a.m., she was required to send a localized, encrypted ping from Julian's private server. It was a dead man's switch. If the ping didn't go through, Vance's automated protocols would execute the final phase of his leverage. David is alive, she repeated to herself, a desperate, glowing ember of joy fighting against the suffocating darkness of her reality. He came back to me. She closed her eyes, remembering the sheer, terrifying power of his presence in the penthouse. For a fraction of a second, she had wanted to throw herself across the room, bury her face in his chest, and sob until she couldn't breathe. But Julian's hand had been resting inches from a hidden panic button under the mattress. If she had shown loyalty to David, if Julian realized his leverage was broken, the collateral damage would have been catastrophic. The heavy deadbolt of the bedroom door slid back with a loud, metallic clack. Mira spun around, her spine snapping perfectly straight, her face instantly smoothing into an expression of polite indifference. It was a mask she had perfected over 60 days of living in a snake pit. David stepped into the room. He carried a small silver tray with a steaming mug of tea and a folded pile of sweatpants and a sweater. He looked devastatingly handsome and utterly exhausted. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of months of brutal warfare. He closed the door behind him and locked it. He set the tray down on a side table and turned to her. The silence stretched between them, thick, charged, and suffocating. The air in the room grew heavy with the overwhelming weight of his alpha aura, pressing against her skin, demanding submission. "Put the clothes on," David said softly. His tone wasn't a request. Mira didn't move to take off his trench coat. Instead, she reached out and pulled the oversized sweater over her head, letting the heavy coat drop to the floor only after she was covered. She stepped into the sweatpants, pulling the drawstrings tight. She felt slightly less vulnerable, though under David's piercing gaze, clothes offered little protection. "Who were you supposed to call, Mira?" David asked. He didn't yell. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his muscular arms over his chest. "My broker," Mira lied smoothly, her voice steady. "The Asian markets open soon. I had assets to move." David laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that scraped against the walls. He pushed off the doorframe and slowly closed the distance between them. Mira forced herself not to step back, anchoring her feet to the rug. "You always were a terrible liar," David murmured, stopping mere inches from her. The heat radiating off his body was intoxicating. The scent of rain, pine, and his unique spicy musk flooded her senses, making her inner wolf whimper in desperate longing. "Your pulse is steady," which means you've practiced the lie. But your pupils are dilated, Mira. You're terrified. He reached up, his large, calloused hand gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. The tenderness of the gesture, contrasting with the lethal tension of his posture, nearly broke her. Marcus told me everything, David said, his voice dropping to a hypnotic, gravelly whisper. I know about the hostile takeovers. I know about the evictions. I know you offered yourself to Vance to save the pack because you thought I was rotting under a glacier. Mira swallowed hard, refusing to break eye contact. If you know, then why am I locked in here like a criminal? Because, David's eyes darkened. A Luna who sacrifices herself for her pack negotiates a treaty from across a boardroom table. She doesn't strip down to silk and climb into the enemy's bed. Unless... He stepped closer, his chest brushing against hers. She is forced to, or unless she is playing a role to get close to something. Mira's breath hitched. He was too smart. He was dissecting her operation with terrifying speed. You don't smell like him, Mira, David whispered, his thumb tracing the sharp line of her jaw. He hasn't touched you, not really. Why are you playing the whore for a man who hasn't even claimed you? Stop, she whispered, her voice finally cracking. She slapped his hand away, stepping back, creating space before she shattered completely. You don't understand what you've done, David. You don't understand the human world. You can't just rip out throats to solve problems anymore. Tell me what leverage he has on you, David demanded, the alpha command lacing his tone, vibrating in the floorboards. I can't. A tear finally slipped down her cheek, a stark line of silver in the dim light. If I tell you, and you try to fix it your way, he will kill them. David's brow furrowed in sudden, sharp confusion. Them? Before Mira could answer, a loud, piercing alarm echoed through the estate. It wasn't the perimeter breach alarm. It was the internal, secure line priority ring. David pulled a heavy, encrypted radio from his belt. Status. Marcus's voice crackled through the speaker, breathless and laced with raw panic. Sire, turn on the television in the guest room, the financial news network, right now. David grabbed the remote from the nightstand and clicked the screen on. The bright lights of a breaking news broadcast flooded the room. Julian Vance was standing at a podium, looking immaculate and unbothered, a swarm of human reporters flashing cameras in his face. Effective as of 3 a.m. this morning. Julian's smooth, televised voice filled the room. Vance Corp has fully executed the transfer clauses on the collateral assets. As the primary stakeholder, I am announcing the immediate foreclosure and liquidation of the Binan sanctuary properties, including the historical Alpha Estate. David stared at the screen, his blood running cold. Julian looked directly into the camera, a smirk playing on his bruised lips. The bruise David had given him. To the current residents, you have 24 hours to vacate my property, or I will have the state authorities remove you by force. The broadcast looped in the background, Julian Vance's smug televised face glowing like a radioactive beacon in the dim guest room. The silence that followed his announcement was absolute, broken only by the relentless drumming of rain against the reinforced glass. David didn't blink. He stared at the screen, his mind, sharpened by decades of leading a hidden apex species, rapidly processing the magnitude of the threat. Vance wasn't sending silver bullets or rogue assassins. He was sending human bulldozers armed with court orders to the Binan sanctuary. Binan was more than just a territory. Nestled deep within the mist-shrouded limestone karsts of Ninh Bin, The sanctuary was the ancestral heart of the pack. Its winding subterranean caves held their history, their vulnerable pups, and the ancient, undeniable proof of their non-human existence. If human developers tore through the forest canopy, the masquerade would end. A human military intervention would follow, and their species would be hunted to extinction. David slowly turned his head to look at his Luna. Mira was standing perfectly still, her eyes squeezed shut, a single tear cutting a track down her pale cheek. The oversized sweater hung off her shoulders, making her look fragile. A tragic illusion, David knew, for a woman made of titanium. This was the dead man's switch, David said, his voice terrifyingly calm. It wasn't a question. Mira opened her eyes. The mask of polite indifference was completely gone, leaving only raw, burning exhaustion. Every night at 3 a.m., I had to authenticate my presence on his private network. A proof of life, proof of compliance. If I missed the ping, the automated legal algorithms filed the foreclosure paperwork with the regional human courts. How did he get the deeds? David asked, closing the distance between them, his anger shifting from the sharp sting of jealousy to a cold, tactical fury. The land trusts have been buried under shell companies for a century. Because you died, David. Mira's voice cracked, her composure finally fracturing. She looked up at him, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce defense. The moment the council declared you KIA, the primary biometric locks on our offshore accounts froze. We were locked out of our own treasury. Vance had already been buying up our external debts. He bribed the regional zoning officials. He manipulated the human banks into calling in our loans all at once. A margin call we couldn't pay. She took a shaky breath, wrapping her arms around her waist. He didn't want a war. He wanted to pave over Bin An and turn our history into a luxury eco-resort, laughing while we bled out in the human courts. 2 months ago, the first eviction notices hit the lower village. The elders were preparing to shift and slaughter the human police, which would have brought the National Army down on us. David finished, the horrifying picture crystallizing in his mind. I had no alpha. I had no army. Mira whispered, stepping toward him, her sense spiking with distress. I had 24 hours before our people started a war they would lose. So, I went to his tower. I offered him the only thing he wanted more than our destruction. David's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking frantically. You. He is obsessed with dominance, David. He wanted the Alpha King's Luna as a trophy. He agreed to freeze the foreclosures as long as I remained in his penthouse, playing the part of his conquered prize. She let out a hollow, bitter laugh. He never forced himself on me. He liked the psychological torture too much. He liked knowing I was sitting in his bed, hating him, but bound to him to keep our people alive. David looked at the woman he loved. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the rigid tension in her spine, the sheer, unimaginable weight she had carried alone for 60 days. His inner wolf, which had been howling for her blood an hour ago, now whimpered in profound, crushing shame. She hadn't betrayed him. She had thrown herself on a grenade to save his kingdom. David reached out, his large hands gently gripping her shoulders. He pulled her forward, ignoring the wet trench coat, and wrapped his arms around her. Mira stiffened for a fraction of a second before crumbling. A choked sob tore from her throat, and she buried her face into his chest, her hands gripping his shirt like a drowning sailor clinging to driftwood. David rested his chin on the top of her head, closing his eyes as he breathed in her vanilla scent, feeling the violent tremors racking her body. I'm sorry, he whispered fiercely into her hair. I'm so damn sorry I left you alone. He held her until the trembling subsided, letting the warmth of their severed bond begin to heal in the quiet dark of the room. But the clock on the wall ticked mercilessly. 3:45 a.m. David gently pulled back, keeping his hands on her waist, his golden eyes locked onto hers, glowing with renewed, lethal purpose. "Are you ready to stop playing the hostage?" Mira wiped her face with the back of her sleeve. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the calculating, sharp gaze of a Luna. "What's the play?" "We have 24 hours before Vance's private security and the human state police arrive at the Binan gates," David said, turning toward the door. "We are going to take back our home, and then we are going to bury Julian Vance under his own empire." The heavy deadbolt of the guest room clicked, and David swung the door open. Marcus was standing in the hallway, flanked by 2 elite pack guards. The Beta's hand was resting on the hilt of a tactical blade, his face pale as he anticipated his Alpha's wrath. Instead, David strode past him, holding Mira's hand firmly in his. "Marcus, stand down the perimeter guard," David barked, his voice carrying the resonant, absolute authority of the king. "I want the war room operational in 5 minutes. Wake up the financial division. Get the legal team on encrypted comms. Not a single wolf shifts tonight. We are fighting this on human paper." Marcus blinked, his eyes darting from David to Mira, before a wave of immense relief washed over his weathered features. "Yes, sire. Right away." The underground war room was a stark contrast to the antique luxury of the estate above. Buried deep within the limestone bedrock of Binan, the bunker was lined with server racks, glowing holographic tables, and the low, constant hum of heavy-duty cooling fans. By 4:15 a.m., the room was packed with the pack's sharpest minds, wolves wearing tailored suits, their eyes glued to rapidly scrolling data streams. David stood at the head of the central glass table, leaning over a digitized map of their territory. The red zones, properties Vance now legally claimed, covered 90% of the map. The transfer of deeds is automated through the human federal system. An older wolf named Silas, the head of their legal division, said grimly, tapping a tablet. "Vance's algorithms are airtight. The moment the Luna missed the 3 a.m. ping, the smart contracts executed. By sunrise, human contractors will have the legal authority to breach the perimeter." "Can we freeze the transfer?" David asked, his eyes scanning the data. "Only if we can prove the initial debt acquisition was fraudulent," Silas replied. "But Vance used a labyrinth of offshore shell companies to buy our loans. We'd need a forensic accounting team 6 months to trace the bribes. We have 23 hours. Silence fell over the war room. The sheer scale of the corporate trap felt insurmountable. "We don't need 6 months." A quiet, steady voice cut through the hum of the servers. All eyes turned to Mira. She had changed out of the oversized sweatpants into a sharp, charcoal gray blazer and tailored trousers. Her armor. She walked up to the holographic table and plugged a small black USB drive into the main terminal. A massive, complex web of data nodes exploded onto the screen, connecting Julian Vance's legitimate holding company to dozens of illegal black market accounts. David stared at the screen, then at his mate, a slow, predatory smile creeping onto his face. "Mira, what is this? Did you honestly think I spent 2 months in that penthouse just staring at the wall?" Mira asked, her dark eyes flashing with dangerous intelligence. "Vance is an egomaniac. He believed he had broken me. He believed I was a defeated, grieving widow. He was so confident in his dominance that he left his personal server terminal unlocked while he slept." She tapped a key and a specific node pulsed bright blue. "While he slept, I mapped his entire digital infrastructure, I found the ledger, the real one. Murmurs of shock and awe rippled through the pack's financial team. Silas pushed his glasses up his nose, staring at the screen like it was the Holy Grail. By the moon. Luna. This is a complete record of his wire fraud. He used embezzled funds from human pension plans to buy our debt. If the Human Securities and Exchange Commission sees this, he goes to a federal penitentiary for the rest of his life. Sending it to the SEC takes too long. David countered, his mind racing. Bureaucracy is slow. We need the bulldozer stopped today. We don't send it to the authorities, Mira said, looking directly at David, her lips curving into a lethal smirk that made his heart race. We send it to his shareholders, and we use it to execute a hostile takeover of our own. David stood up straight, the tactical puzzle snapping perfectly into place. Since the human world believed David was dead, the biometric locks on the Alpha Estate's massive offshore wealth were frozen. But David wasn't dead. Silas, David commanded, his voice vibrating with adrenaline. Initiate the resurrection protocol. Alert the Swiss banks that the Alpha King is breathing. Unfreeze our treasury. Silas's hands flew across the keyboard. It will take massive capital to execute a blitz buyout of Vance's shares before the market opens, sire. It will drain our liquid reserves. Drain them, David ordered. He looked at the digitized map of Bin An, the home his ancestors had carved from the mountain. Vance thought he could use human money to buy our home. Let's show him what happens when a wolf learns how to play Wall Street. He turned to Mira, the pride in his chest swelling so large it physically ached. Upload the fraud ledger to every major financial news outlet on a time delay for 8 a.m. When the markets open, Vance Corp's stock is going to free fall. And we are going to buy his empire for pennies on the dollar. The underground war room became a crucible of adrenaline and blinding speed. By 6 a.m., the air was thick with the scent of ozone from overheating processors and the sharp, acidic tang of cheap human coffee the financial team was chugging like water. David stood at the center of the chaos, an immovable pillar of authority. He watched his pack operate not with claws and fangs, but with algorithms, encrypted data packets, and ruthless corporate precision. But his gaze kept returning to the woman orchestrating the slaughter. Mira stood beside Silas at the main terminal, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, her fingers flying across a tablet as she coordinated the upload of Vance's illegal ledgers. She was a maestro conducting a symphony of financial ruin. The fragility she had shown in the guest room was completely gone, replaced by the terrifying, cold-blooded intellect that made her the perfect Luna. The Swiss consortium is demanding secondary authentication for the Treasury release. Silas called out, his voice tight. The liquid reserves are massive, sire. The human bankers think it's a glitch. They want a biometric retinal scan and a verbal passcode over a secure channel. David walked over to the terminal. He leaned down, aligning his eye with the scanner Silas presented. A green laser swept across his iris. Passcode. The automated voice of the Swiss operator echoed through the speakers. Fenrir's shadow, David said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. There was a torturous 10-second pause, filled only by the hum of the cooling fans. Then the operator's voice returned, laced with a tremor of shock. Authentication confirmed. Welcome back, Mr. Vance. Apologies, welcome back, Mr. Sterling. The freeze on the Bin An Sovereign Trust has been lifted. You have access to $42 billion in liquid capital. A ragged cheer erupted from the wolves in the room. Silas didn't waste a millisecond. His hands blurred across the keyboard, routing the ancient, accumulated wealth of the Werewolf monarchy into a network of aggressive, automated trading bots. David stepped back and looked at Mira. She was staring at the screen, her chest heaving slightly, the realization of what they were about to pull off finally hitting her. He reached out and gently wrapped his hand around the back of her neck, his thumb stroking the soft skin at her hairline. She leaned into his touch, a quiet, shuddering exhale escaping her lips. It was the first moment of genuine peace they had shared since he kicked down the door of Vance's penthouse. "You saved us," David whispered, leaning down so only she could hear him over the din of the room. "You walked into the serpent's den, unarmed, and you mapped its throat. I have never been more proud of you." Mira looked up at him, her dark eyes softening. "I swore an oath to protect this pack, David. I thought I was doing it alone." "You will never fight alone again," he promised, his golden eyes burning with fierce devotion. 10 minutes to market open," Marcus announced from the door, his eyes glued to the massive digital clock on the far wall. "The news outlets have the data packets queued. Sire, if this fails, we won't just lose Bin Han. We will bankrupt the entire bloodline." "It won't fail," David said, his voice echoing with absolute, unshakable certainty. He looked at the holographic map of their territory. The sun was beginning to rise over the limestone mountains above them. Vance wanted a corporate war. Give it to him. At 7:55 a.m., Mira pressed the final execution key. The encrypted packets, containing undeniable proof of Julian Vance's embezzlement, wire fraud, and illegal manipulation of human pension funds, bypassed the human SEC and went directly to the inboxes of the top investigative journalists at 3 major global financial networks. The war room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Every eye in the room shifted to the massive array of televisions mounted on the northern wall. At 7:58 a.m., a breaking news banner flashed across the screen of the leading financial channel in blood-red text. The human anchor's face went pale as he pressed a finger to his earpiece, interrupting a segment on quarterly earnings. "We are interrupting our broadcast with a massive, unprecedented story breaking this morning," the anchor stammered, looking at a tablet off camera. "We have just received a massive data dump, which our analysts are currently authenticating, that appears to show Julian Vance, CEO of Vance Corp., has been operating a multi-billion-dollar shadow ledger." David's lips curved into a lethal smile. The trap was sprung. 8 a.m. The opening bell of the stock exchange rang. It was an absolute, unmitigated bloodbath. On the monitors in the war room, the ticker for Vance Corp, VNC, didn't just dip. It fell off a cliff. Panic selling triggered automated human trading algorithms, compounding the disaster. Within 60 seconds, the stock lost 40% of its value. By 8:05 a.m., trading was halted due to extreme volatility, but the damage in the dark pools had already been done. Vance Corp was hemorrhaging billions. "Silas," David ordered, his eyes locked on the plummeting red line. "Execute the buyout." "Deploying the sterling capital now," Silas barked, his fingers flying. David's trading bots hit the market like a pack of starved wolves. They bypassed the halted public exchanges, targeting the terrified institutional investors in the private sector who were desperate to offload Vance's toxic assets. They bought the debt. They bought the shares. They bought the holding companies. 51% acquired, Silas announced, his voice trembling with sheer awe. 60%. "Sire, we have a controlling interest. You just bought Vance Corp for a fraction of its value. You are his boss." The war room erupted. Wolves were howling, slamming their hands on the desks, the oppressive weight of the last 6 months vanishing in an instant of glorious, ruthless victory. Mira slumped against the table, her hands covering her face as a single, ragged sob of relief tore from her throat. David pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her dark hair, letting his own triumphant roar rumble through his chest. They had won. They had protected their home without shedding a single drop of blood. Or so he thought. The victory celebration was shattered by a sound that made every wolf in the room freeze. It wasn't the secure phone lines. It was the blaring, high-pitched wail of the Binon perimeter defense sirens. The physical alarms. Marcus sprinted to a secondary terminal, pulling up the hidden security cameras placed in the forest canopy miles away from the estate. "Sire," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a horrified whisper. David released Mira and strode to the monitor. The road leading to the sanctuary was clogged with heavy, armored transport vehicles. They weren't human police or state authorities carrying eviction notices. They were unbranded, matte black trucks. Dozens of heavily armed mercenaries, human PMCs, were pouring out of the vehicles, carrying assault rifles, breaching charges, and, to David's absolute horror, heavy flamethrowers. "Vance," Mira breathed, her face draining of color. Suddenly, David's encrypted satellite phone vibrated violently against his hip. He pulled it out. The caller ID was blocked. He answered it, putting it on speaker for the room to hear. "You think you're clever, Sterling?" Julian Vance's voice spat from the speaker. Gone was the smooth, arrogant billionaire. The voice was ragged, manic, and completely unhinged. "I think you're unemployed, Julian," David said coldly, "and looking at 10 to 20 years in a federal penitentiary." "I don't care about the company," Julian screamed, a hysterical edge to his voice. "You ruined me. You embarrassed me. The feds are already outside my building. I have nothing left to lose, but neither do you. Recall your mercenaries, Vance. They are trespassing on private property," David warned, his inner beast clawing violently at his chest. "They aren't there to evict you anymore, David." Julian laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "They are there to burn Binon to the ground. They don't know what you are. But they know I paid them 50 million offshore dollars to kill every breathing thing in that valley. The human world is going to watch your sanctuary burn on live television." The line went dead. David lowered the phone. The corporate game was over. Julian's ego had snapped, and he had unleashed a scorched earth protocol. If those mercenaries breached the tree line, if they saw wolves shifting, the secret of their species would be exposed to the world, resulting in a global hunt. "Sire?" Marcus asked, his hand dropping to the hilt of his tactical blade, his eyes flashing yellow. David turned to his pack. The billionaire CEO vanished, and the Alpha King stepped forward. "Shut down the servers!" David roared, his voice shaking the dust from the limestone ceiling. "Marcus, sound the combat horn. Wake every warrior in the valley. We do not shift. We fight them as men. Not a single mercenary crosses the river." He looked at Mira, his heart aching with the sudden, violent pivot of their reality. Secure the elders and the pups in the deep caverns. Mira didn't argue. She nodded, her eyes hardening into obsidian. "Give them hell, my king." The dawn light struggled to pierce the thick, weeping canopy of the Nin Bin jungle. The air was saturated with the heavy scent of wet limestone, crushed ferns, and the approaching, unnatural metallic tang of diesel engines. David stood perfectly still behind the massive, ancient trunk of a banyan tree, the rain plastering his dark shirt to his chest. He closed his eyes, drawing in a slow, measured breath. The beast inside him was thrashing against its cage, roaring to be let loose, begging to tear through the encroaching threat with claws and fangs. It took every ounce of his legendary willpower to suppress the shift. To his left and right, camouflaged within the dense foliage of the karst valley, 50 of his most elite warriors waited in absolute, terrifying silence. They carried no firearms. They wielded tactical batons, heavy hunting blades, and the devastating advantage of their enhanced, though unshifted, human strength. Convoy is halting at the river crossing. Marcus whispered through the earpiece, his voice barely a breath of static. 200 meters from your position, sire. Hold the line, David ordered softly. No one moves until they cross the water. Let them bottleneck. Through the trees, the rumble of the matte black transport trucks ceased. The heavy thud of combat boots hitting the muddy jungle floor echoed through the valley. Through the foliage, David watched as dozens of mercenaries fanned out. They were heavily armored, their faces hidden behind ballistic masks, moving with the disciplined precision of a top-tier private military company. The lead mercenary signaled forward. The vanguard stepped into the shallow, rushing waters of the river that marked the true boundary of the Bin-An sanctuary. David opened his eyes. They flashed a brilliant, luminous gold in the gloom. Now, the Alpha King commanded. The ambush was a masterclass in apex predation. The wolves did not scream or shout. They descended from the trees and erupted from the underbrush like phantoms. David moved with blinding speed, a blur of calculated violence. He intercepted the lead mercenary before the man could raise his assault rifle. David's hand clamped around the barrel of the weapon, crushing the steel mechanism, while his other hand delivered a devastating, open-palm strike to the man's armored chest. The mercenary flew backward, unconscious before he hit the water. Chaos erupted, but it was a controlled, one-sided slaughter. The mercenaries, expecting a compound of terrified corporate holdouts, found themselves fighting an enemy that moved too fast to track and hit with the force of an armored vehicle. Rifles were stripped from hands, kneecaps were shattered with tactical batons, and bodies were hurled into the mud. David ducked under a sweeping combat knife, pivoting smoothly to drive his elbow into his attacker's jaw. But out of the corner of his eye, he saw a horrifying shift in tactics. A heavy-set mercenary had fallen back toward the trucks, bracing a massive, pressurized flamethrower. He was aiming blindly at the thickest part of the tree line, ready to incinerate the forest. David's heart stopped. If the fire caught the canopy, the smoke would draw the surrounding villages. If he didn't reach the man in time, wolves would burn. The beast inside David clawed frantically, demanding the speed of a full shift to cross the 50 yards in time. David's muscles bunched, the agonizing prelude to the bone-breaking transformation beginning. Wee woo wee woo. The deafening, localized wail of state-issued police sirens shattered the jungle canopy. Suddenly, the roar of heavy rotor blades beat the air from above. Two massive, unmarked tactical helicopters crested the limestone mountains, spotlight beams cutting through the rain, illuminating the riverbed in blinding white light. Drop your weapons. This is the National Police Force. You are surrounded. A voice boomed in Vietnamese over a megaphone from the choppers. From the main access road behind the mercenaries, a dozen armored police vehicles slammed on their brakes, effectively barricading the PMC trucks. Heavily armed state tactical units poured out, leveling their weapons at the stunned mercenaries. The mercenary with the flamethrower froze, dropping the heavy tank to the mud and raising his hands. All across the riverbed, the remaining conscious mercenaries dropped their rifles, realizing they were entirely outgunned by the state military. David stepped back into the shadows of the tree line, his chest heaving, his half-shifted fangs receding as he stared at the flashing red and blue lights. His earpiece clicked. Target neutralized, my king. Mira's voice floated into his ear, smooth and laced with fierce triumph. "Mira, what did you do?" David asked, a disbelieving laugh escaping his chest. "Julian Vance hired a foreign PMC to attack an ecological reserve," Mira explained, the sound of keyboard clicking echoing behind her. 10 minutes ago, as the new majority shareholder of Vance Corp., I officially terminated the PMC's contract. Then, I forwarded their GPS coordinates and illegal weapons manifest to the Vietnamese Ministry of Public Security, reporting a rogue terrorist cell operating on our corporate property. The state just saved us the trouble of burying them. David leaned his head back against the rough bark of the banyan tree, the rain washing the mud from his face. She hadn't just beaten Vance at his own game. She had weaponized the human world to protect the pack's ultimate secret. 30 minutes later, David walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the Alpha estate. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a profound, aching peace in its wake. He walked past the cheering wolves in the grand hall, his eyes searching. He found her in the study. Mira was standing by the massive window, looking out over the sanctuary. She wore the oversized sweater he had given her, the first hints of a genuine smile gracing her lips. David crossed the room in 3 strides. He wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, burying his face into the crook of her neck. He breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the scent of rain and vanilla, untainted, pure, and finally home. Mira leaned back against his solid chest, her hands resting over his. "The board of directors is requesting a meeting tomorrow morning," Mira murmured, turning her head to press a soft kiss to his jaw. "They want to know who is running the company." "Let them wait," David whispered, turning her in his arms and capturing her lips with his own. The kiss was a vow, a seal upon the unbreakable bond that had survived the very edge of ruin. He was the king. But looking into her dark, brilliant eyes, he knew who truly commanded his world. The Luna is busy. David and Mira's harrowing journey from the brink of destruction to complete victory proves that the strongest packs are built not just on raw power, but on unshakable trust and brilliant strategy. By conquering the boardroom and the battlefield, the Alpha King and his Luna secured their sanctuary and cemented their legacy forever. If you were captivated by this thrilling tale of loyalty, high-stakes corporate warfare, and the unbreakable bond of mates, please consider hitting that like button. Share this story with your fellow romance and suspense lovers, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping cinematic stories of alphas, suspense, and romance. Until next time.